Mason Reed stepped into the ring wearing the smile that had carried him through 11 title defenses, sure of the ending. Across from him stood Ella Carter, a quiet woman from a forgotten gym in Baltimore, in a faded jacket that drew laughter from the cameras before the opening bell rang. Reporters called the matchup a stunt, and Mason promised the crowd it would be finished before the third round. Ella had not traveled there for pity. She carried a secret, a broken promise, and an endurance that would leave the arena breathless when the bell for round 15 rang. Stay until the very last bell rings to see how one silent punch could break a crown built on lies. The press conference in Las Vegas had been built for exactly one purpose, and that purpose was Mason Reed. He walked into the ballroom in a tailored charcoal suit, a watch worth more than most people's cars catching the light with every gesture, and a wall of cameras turned toward him like sunflowers chasing the sun. He had defended his middleweight title more times than any fighter of his generation, and the room around him had long since stopped treating him like a man and started treating him like a brand. Reporters leaned forward when he spoke. Sponsors smiled when he laughed. For nearly a decade, nobody in that sport had given him a reason to feel anything but certain. Ella Carter entered through a side door without an entourage, without a stylist, without anyone clearing a path ahead of her. She wore a faded gray training jacket with a frayed zipper, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, and she carried herself the way a person does when they have spent years being underestimated and decided long ago that it no longer needed an explanation. Behind her walked only her trainer, Logan Shaw, and a young assistant carrying a medical bag. A few reporters near the front exchanged glances and laughed under their breath before she had even taken her seat. Somebody in the back row was already filming her for a clip that would later be titled as a joke. Mason looked across the stage at her, tilted his head, and let a slow smile spread across his face before he ever reached for the microphone. He told the room that he respected every fighter who stepped into a ring, but he could not understand why a woman who looked like she had wandered in from a neighborhood gym was sharing a stage with the middleweight champion of the world. The ballroom erupted into laughter, and Mason let it wash over him like applause. Ella did not flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on him with a stillness that unsettled the few people paying close enough attention to notice it. Madison Blake, a sports journalist known for her sharp accents and sharper instincts, leaned into her microphone and asked Ella directly whether she truly believed she could survive past the third round. The room quieted just enough to hear the answer. Ella said she had not come there to survive. She said she had come to finish something that should have happened years earlier, and the words landed with a weight that made Logan lower his eyes and made Carter Hayes, Mason's promoter, signal quickly for the next question. Mason's smile faltered for the briefest instant before he covered it with another laugh, louder than the first. By the end of the session, Mason rose from his chair, leaned close to his microphone, and declared with theatrical confidence that the fight would be over before the third round even began. The cameras loved it. The headlines were already writing themselves before anyone left the building. Ella stood as well, gathered her jacket around her shoulders, and offered only one sentence before walking off the stage. She told him that if he truly believed that, he would not need to smile so often while saying it. The room fell briefly silent, unsure whether they had just watched confidence or something far more dangerous standing quietly across from it. Far from the lights of Las Vegas, in a basement gym on the edge of Baltimore, Ella Carter had spent years building the version of herself nobody in that ballroom had bothered to see. The gym had no modern equipment, no flashing signage, no wealthy sponsor's logo stitched onto the walls. The paint was peeling, the floorboards creaked beneath worn mats, and the heavy bag in the corner had been patched so many times it barely resembled its original shape. It was, in every visible way, the opposite of glamorous. It was also the only place where Ella had ever felt completely understood. Logan Shaw stood near the ropes most evenings, watching her move through footwork drills with the quiet attention of a man who had learned long ago not to waste praise. He rarely complimented her directly, but anyone who studied his face during her hardest rounds of sparring could see something steady building behind his eyes. Ella did not possess the explosive power that fighters like Mason Reed were known for. What she had instead was patience, a rare gift for reading rhythm, and an uncanny ability to grow calmer the longer an opponent grew frustrated. Logan had trained dozens of fighters over the years, but none of them had her particular kind of stillness. Years earlier, Ella had been a rising prospect with real promise until a controversial decision ended that climb before it ever truly began. She had defeated a fighter connected to a powerful promotional company, only to watch the judges hand him a verdict that made no sense to anyone who had actually watched the match. Afterward, she was quietly labeled difficult to work with. Her sponsors disappeared within months, and the opportunities that once seemed inevitable simply stopped arriving. She vanished from the sports spotlight, not because her skill had faded, but because the system around her had decided she was no longer convenient. Logan had been present that night, watching from a seat close enough to see everything and far enough away to do nothing about it. He suspected Carter Hayes had played a role in what happened, though he never had enough proof to say so publicly. The injustice of it followed Ella for years, but she refused to wear it like a wound on display. She worked an ordinary job during the day, trained alone late into the night, and waited for one real opportunity to step onto a stage large enough that nobody could look away from what happened next. This part of her story was never about asking for sympathy. Ella never wanted to be remembered as someone wronged. She wanted only the chance to fight one fair fight in front of the entire world, with nothing rigged, nothing hidden, and nothing decided before the bell ever rang. That hunger, quiet and patient, shaped every single round of training that followed, long after most people assumed she had disappeared for good. Before she left for Las Vegas, Logan handed her a worn notebook filled with notes on Mason Reed's tendencies, the rhythm of his combinations, and the moments when his discipline tended to slip. He told her that Mason could beat almost anyone across 6 hard rounds, but nobody had ever pulled him into the one place he truly feared, deep into a fight, all the way to round 15, where his talent alone would no longer be enough to save him. Mason Reed was not simply a fighter, he had become an entire commercial enterprise built around his own reflection. He had endorsement deals stacked across several industries, a documentary chronicling his rise, a signature line of boxing shoes, and a media team that managed every photograph and every headline with surgical precision. To the wider public, Mason represented discipline, dominance, and an almost mythical inevitability. Every win added another brick to an image so carefully constructed that few people ever stopped to ask what stood underneath it. Behind the scenes, however, Mason had grown comfortable with opponents chosen for convenience rather than genuine danger. Carter Hayes, his promoter, had spent years carefully selecting challengers who looked threatening enough to create excitement but never posed any real risk to the champion's record. Ella had initially been chosen for similar reasons. Carter's team believed her story made for an easy commercial narrative. A humble underdog from a forgotten gym defeated decisively by the reigning champion, proof that Mason could dominate absolutely anyone placed in front of him. Mason had not always been this way, but years of relentless praise had slowly reshaped him. He believed almost everything written about him, and that belief left little room for humility. He dismissed Ella the moment he saw her, not because he had studied her skill and found it lacking, but because she did not look like a star, did not speak with bravado, and never created the kind of controversy his media team loved to promote. To Mason, quiet had always meant weak, and he had never once been forced to reconsider that assumption. In a private locker room days before the fight, Mason reviewed old footage of Ella with mild amusement, noting that her speed seemed unremarkable. His technical assistant, Ryan Cooper, watched the same footage far more carefully and noticed something far more unsettling. Ella almost never repeated the same mistake twice after being hit. Each exchange seemed to teach her something new about her opponent, and the longer Ryan studied the tape, the more uneasy he became about what that pattern might mean across a fight that lasted many rounds. Ryan warned Mason directly that Ella could become genuinely dangerous if the fight stretched on too long, but Mason waved the concern away without hesitation, certain that nobody had ever pushed him anywhere near round 15 and nobody ever would. Carter Hayes quietly told Ryan to keep his doubts to himself, worried that any hint of uncertainty might disturb the champion's confidence before fight night. Mason, for his part, looked one final time at the promotional poster featuring both fighters side by side, drew a careless line across Ella's photograph with a marker, and remarked that 3 rounds already felt generous. The official weigh-in took place in front of hundreds of cameras, every angle of the stage lit for maximum drama. Mason arrived with the presence of a man fully aware of his own image, his physique flawless under the lighting, his confidence radiating outward without effort. Ella stepped onto the scale to a low murmur of whispers throughout the crowd. Some spectators thought she looked too ordinary, too quiet, lacking whatever quality a true title challenger was supposed to project before stepping into a fight this large. During the staged face-off photographs, Mason leaned close to Ella and murmured that she still had time to withdraw before turning herself into a punchline. Ella did not step back. She held his gaze evenly and told him that men who spoke this much rarely felt as certain as they pretended to be. For a brief moment, something flickered across Mason's expression, a flash of irritation he quickly buried beneath another practiced laugh. In front of the cameras, he announced that Ella showed plenty of courage. though courage alone had never been enough to match true class. Carter Hayes stood behind him, satisfied that the exchange would help sell additional tickets before fight night. Afterward, Madison Blake pulled Ella aside for a private interview. Curious why she never answered Mason with the same sharpness he aimed at her, Ella explained simply that words never tired an opponent, but every round of a real fight eventually did. Madison studied her for a long moment, sensing an unusual calm beneath the surface that did not match the picture painted by the rest of the press. It was the kind of stillness that made a careful observer start asking different questions. Later that evening, an anonymous account posted an old video online showing Ella years earlier defeating a highly regarded fighter, only for the judges to controversially overturn the result against her. The clip spread quickly before disappearing just as fast, pulled down within the hour. Madison, however, had already saved a copy before it vanished. She began to suspect that the story surrounding Ella's career was far more complicated than the simple underdog narrative everyone in the arena had been sold. That night, Ella returned to her modest hotel room and wrapped her hands slowly in front of the mirror while the lights of the city glittered far below her window. She studied her own reflection without flinching, thinking back on every year that had led to this single fight. Quietly, almost to herself, she whispered that this time nobody would be able to silence the final bell before the truth had its chance to be heard. Back at their training base, Logan Shaw laid out the truth of the matchup as plainly as he could. Mason Reed was at his most dangerous across the first several rounds of any fight, when his speed, power, and instincts were sharpest and his confidence had not yet been tested. But Mason carried one significant weakness that few opponents had ever managed to expose. He had never once been forced to genuinely doubt himself in the middle of a long, grinding fight, because no one had ever survived long enough to make him feel that doubt. The plan Logan built was not designed to defeat Mason early. Ella would need to survive with discipline, absorb pressure intelligently, frustrate him gradually, and force him to throw more punches than necessary while burning through his own composure. The objective was to stretch the contest deep into the championship rounds, past 10, past 12, and ultimately into round 15, the one place Mason had never truly been required to face the fear of losing. It was a strategy built on patience rather than spectacle, and patience rarely won applause from a crowd looking for fireworks. Ella understood exactly how dangerous this approach could become. She would absorb real punishment, endure ridicule from spectators who assumed she was simply outmatched, and risk having the fight stopped early if she appeared too overwhelmed at any point. Because of this, she needed sharp, intelligent defense and the discipline to land enough clean counters to convince everyone watching, including the officials, that she still belonged in the fight at every stage. Logan reminded her repeatedly about what he called Mason's third breath, a small tell that appeared whenever Mason threw a specific three-punch combination. In that brief instant, his lead shoulder dropped just slightly lower than usual, creating the only real opening Logan had ever identified on film. That opening, however, only appeared clearly once Mason had grown tired and overconfident, never in the opening rounds when his guard remained tight and disciplined. Grace Miller, the event's attending physician, examined Ella during a routine pre-fight check and was visibly surprised by her recovery rates between intense exertion intervals, numbers far superior to many seasoned professional fighters she had tested before. It became clear to Grace that Ella had not prepared for a brief, explosive performance. She had prepared for a long, grueling war that very few fighters were physically or mentally equipped to survive. This entire stretch of preparations was meant to establish that the coming fight would not simply be a story of strength defeating weakness. It would be a contest between intelligence, endurance, and quiet resolve against reputation, raw power, and unchecked arrogance. Before Ella left for the arena that final time, Logan asked her one last question, wondering aloud what she intended to do if she was still standing when round 15 finally arrived. Ella answered without hesitation that only then would Mason truly be fighting her fight instead of his own. Fight night arrived inside a packed arena in Las Vegas, lights blazing across every seat, the crowd roaring before either fighter had even appeared. Mason walked out beneath a wall of pyrotechnics and thunderous music, surrounded by a sprawling entourage, soaking in the adoration the way a king might survey his own kingdom. He raised the championship belt high above his head, basking in the noise, utterly certain that the next several minutes would simply confirm everything the world already believed about him. Ella emerged shortly after in comparative silence, with no elaborate entrance, no pyrotechnics, no choreography of any kind. She walked beside Logan with her focus locked entirely on the ring ahead. A portion of the crowd jeered. A few spectators laughed openly at the simplicity of her plain robe, contrasting it loudly with Mason's polished spectacle. The broadcast commentators called it one of the strangest matchups in recent memory, one predicting Mason would use the fight to manufacture another highlight reel, the other trying to sound neutral while privately doubting Ella could last more than a few rounds. Before the opening bell, the referee called both fighters to the center of the ring for final instructions. Mason smiled and murmured that he hoped she had prepared some kind of statement for after her defeat. Ella simply looked at him and replied that she had prepared for round 15 instead. The bell rang, and Mason surged forward immediately, snapping out sharp jabs to control distance and tempo. Ella retreated calmly, slipping and guarding, conserving her energy rather than trading punches early. To the crowd, her caution looked like fear. Mason grew more confident with every passing second, certain that the fight already belonged entirely to him. Near the end of the opening round, he connected with a heavy right hand that sent Ella stumbling briefly toward the ropes. The arena rose to its feet in a thunderous roar. Mason raised his arms in premature celebration, savoring the moment as though the outcome had already been decided in his favor. Ella steadied herself almost immediately, planting her feet and meeting his eyes with a calm that was noticeably different from a few seconds earlier. The bell sounded to end the round, and as Mason turned back toward his corner with a satisfied grin, something in his expression hesitated for just an instant, as though some small part of him had expected her to look far more shaken than she actually did. From round 2 through round 5, Mason controlled the majority of the action inside the ring. He moved with practiced precision, landed clean combinations, and built a scorecard lead that seemed almost inevitable to anyone watching from the outside. Each time he connected solidly, the crowd erupted, feeding his momentum even further. Carter Hayes sat in the front row with a satisfied smile fixed firmly on his face, already imagining the highlight package his media team would assemble once the fight was finished. Ella stayed tucked behind a tight guard, occasionally answering with short, compact counters aimed at Mason's body rather than his head. These punches drew little excitement from the crowd, lacking the flash of a dramatic knockdown, but Logan understood exactly what they were accomplishing beneath the surface. Every shot landed to the ribs, the shoulder, or the stomach quietly chipped away at Mason's stamina, even as the official scorecards continued to favor him round after round. Commentators repeatedly criticized Ella for being too passive, suggesting she had no realistic path back into the fight. Madison Blake, seated in the media section, began watching far more closely than the broadcast narrative suggested. She noticed that Ella never panicked after absorbing a clean shot to the face. Instead, she adjusted her footing slightly. After being cornered against the ropes, she always escaped along a slightly different angle the next time. She appeared to be studying Mason in real time, learning him one exchange at a time. Mason, growing visibly frustrated that Ella refused to collapse, wanted a swift and decisive victory that would validate every bold promise he had made before the fight. He began throwing heavier punches, attempting to end things outright by round 5, but Ella's footwork allowed her to slip beneath several of his attempts, causing him to miss more often than he expected and burn additional energy doing so. In her corner between rounds, Logan offered no loud encouragement and no dramatic speeches. He spoke only a few short instructions each time, reminding her to breathe steadily, to watch his lead shoulder, and to count to 3 before committing to any counter. Ella nodded each time, fully aware that everything remained on schedule despite the bruising forming along her cheekbone and the deep ache spreading through her ribs. By the close of round 5, Mason returned to his corner breathing harder than usual. Ryan Cooper handed him water and warned that he was throwing far too many unnecessary punches for this early in a fight. Mason brushed the warning aside without much thought, though for the first time all night, he did not smile while doing it. While the fight continued, Madison Blake received a message from the same anonymous account that had posted the old video days earlier. This time, the sender included additional material, scoring records showing unusual irregularities, internal messages hinting at quiet interference, and a statement from a retired referee who had officiated Ella's controversial defeat years before. Madison scanned through the documents quickly, fully aware she could not publish anything mid-fight, but understanding clearly that Ella was far more than a fortunate underdog who had simply wandered into a title opportunity. In the ring, Mason continued winning rounds on the official scorecards, yet his frustration kept building beneath the surface. Ella refused to fall, refused to panic, and refused to ask for the fight to be stopped. She continued meeting his gaze with the same level calm, almost as though she were patiently waiting for him to walk directly into a trap of his own making. Carter Hayes learned that Madison was digging into Ella's past and immediately contacted his assistants, demanding that any unfavorable information be suppressed before it could spread further. The tension building outside the ropes had begun to mirror the tension building inside them. What had started as a straightforward boxing match was steadily transforming into something closer to a public reckoning, unfolding in real time in front of millions of witnesses. In round 6, Ella finally unleashed her first clear, decisive counterattack, landing a clean shot directly on Mason's chin. The punch did not knock him down, but it was sharp enough to silence the roaring arena for a single suspended second. Mason staggered back half a step, his eyes widening with surprise. He had not expected her to still possess that kind of speed, after absorbing so much punishment across the previous several rounds. Watching from the press section, Madison looked up toward the ring and understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else inside that building, that Ella was accomplishing something no document or investigation could ever fully capture. She was forcing the entire world to look at her again, not through pity or curiosity, but through undeniable respect earned one difficult round at a time. Round 7 opened with a subtle shift in the rhythm of the fight. Mason still held the lead on every scorecard, but Ella had begun reading the pace of his movement with greater confidence. She slipped his jab by a narrower margin, countered more quickly, and consistently targeted his body whenever an opening appeared. None of these punches looked spectacular to the casual viewer, but each one steadily eroded Mason's stamina, slowing him down in ways that would not become obvious until much later in the fight. In Mason's corner, Ryan Cooper grew increasingly anxious. He urged Mason to fight smarter rather than continuing to rely purely on power, but pride had already taken firm hold of the champion's judgment. Mason could not accept that a fighter he had openly mocked just days earlier was now pulling him deep into the back half of a fight he had promised would end almost immediately. The crowd's attitude continued shifting as well. Spectators who had laughed at Ella during the early rounds now found themselves leaning forward with growing anticipation every time she escaped a dangerous exchange. Her silence had become its own strange magnetism. She never postured, never taunted, never pleaded for sympathy. She simply kept standing, round after round, refusing to give anyone a reason to look away. In round 8, Mason threw his signature three-punch combination, and exactly as Logan had predicted, his lead shoulder dipped for a brief instant. Ella answered immediately with a short, sharp hook to the jaw. Mason's legs wobbled for half a step, and the arena exploded into noise. For the first time in years, the supposedly unbeatable champion had visibly been shaken by an opponent the world had dismissed as a joke only days earlier. Carter Hayes screamed from his seat for Mason to finish the fight immediately, and that pressure only pushed Mason to fight with even less discipline than before. Rounds 9 and 10 became a brutal, grinding battle. Ella absorbed significant punishment throughout both rounds, but Mason's breathing grew heavier. His shoulders sagged lower between exchanges, and the arrogant gleam that had defined his experience all night slowly began to fade. By the close of round 10, Mason sat in his corner staring across the ring at Ella, who looked just as exhausted and just as bruised, yet whose eyes remained completely steady. For the first time, Mason found himself quietly wondering whether he had been fighting someone he had never truly bothered to understand at all. Round 11 saw Mason attempt to reclaim control through experience rather than raw aggression. He leaned on clinches, pressed Ella against the ropes, and slowed the tempo of the fight whenever possible. Ella did not rush. He accepted each brief pause as an opportunity to recover, then returned fire toward his body the moment any opening appeared, patient and unhurried despite the growing exhaustion settling into both fighters. Around this point, Madison received final confirmation from a trusted source that Carter Hayes had once pressured officials to derail Ella's career years earlier. She forwarded the information to her editor, requesting that an investigative feature be prepared for immediate release once the fight concluded. Madison understood, however, that if Ella lost too decisively that night, the public might simply move on without ever confronting the deeper truth. Ella needed a moment so undeniable that the world could not possibly look away from it afterward. In round 12, Mason connected with a tremendous right hand that sent Ella crashing down to the canvas. The arena roared with the kind of explosive sound usually reserved for an ending. Mason raised his arms instinctively, certain the fight was finally over. Logan stood quietly at ringside, saying nothing, watching Ella with unwavering focus. The referee began the count. Ella remained motionless until the count of 7, then planted her gloves against the canvas and rose steadily by the count of 9. That moment stunned Mason more than any punch he had thrown all night. He had ended countless fights with similar shots before. Yet Ella climbed back to her feet not through reckless desperation, but through a kind of disciplined resolve forged across years of being dismissed and underestimated. Grace Miller watched closely from ringside and confirmed that Ella remained alert and fully capable of continuing. Round 13 marked a clear turning point. Ella was no longer simply surviving. She began countering with real purpose and precision. Mason still carried more raw power, but his punches had grown noticeably slower, and every time he missed, Ella made him pay with a sharp shot to the body or the chin. By the end of the round, Mason returned to his corner, furious, snapping at Ryan when reminded to protect his lead on the scorecards. He insisted he had no interest in winning narrowly against someone like Ella. He wanted her down completely. That single statement revealed something important. Mason was no longer fighting with strategy. He was fighting because his pride had been wounded, and pride alone rarely wins a fight that has already gone this far. Round 14 unfolded as the tensest stretch of the entire fight. Both fighters were visibly drained, their bodies marked with bruises and fatigue, their breathing heavy between exchanges. Mason still held a narrow lead on most scorecards, but the gap had clearly closed over the previous several rounds. Ella understood that if the contest ended purely on points, she might once again find herself on the wrong side of an unfair decision, just as she had years earlier. She needed one moment so clear that no judge or commentator could possibly dispute it. Before the round began, Logan reminded Ella that she did not need to dominate every single second remaining. She only needed to lead Mason toward the exact place he feared most. Ella understood immediately. She continued drawing him forward, retreating just enough, slipping just enough, countering just enough to convince Mason that one final big punch might be all it would take to finally put her away for good. Mason's frustration deepened with every passing minute. He could hear sections of the crowd now chanting Ella's name, something that had once belonged entirely to him. The arena he had always considered his personal stage now seemed to be slipping out of his control, cheering instead for the very fighter he had mocked just days earlier. He threw heavier and heavier punches, but his legs no longer carried the same explosive snap they had shown earlier in the fight. Near the end of the round, Mason landed a heavy shot that sent Ella stumbling back into the ropes. The referee studied her closely, hand raised, ready to intervene if necessary. Ella lifted her gloves, pivoted away from the ropes, and answered with a sharp counter to Mason's ribs. Mason doubled slightly at the waist just as the bell rang to end the round. Both fighters returned slowly to their corners. Mason sat down breathing hard, his eyes burning with frustration. Ella lowered herself onto her stool, her face swollen and marked, yet her eyes remained clear and steady. Logan crouched beside her and said quietly that everything she had endured all night had been building toward the final 3 minutes that remained. When the arena fell quiet again in anticipation of the bell signaling round 15, nobody inside that building was laughing anymore. Round 15 began under an atmosphere so thick with anticipation that the entire arena seemed to be holding its breath at once. The laughter from the press conference days earlier felt impossibly distant now. Nobody in that building was mocking Ella Carter anymore. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something exceedingly rare. An undefeated champion pushed to the absolute edge of his limits by the very fighter he had once dismissed as a punchline. Mason surged forward immediately, determined to reclaim the dominant image he had built his entire career around. He fired a sharp jab, followed by a heavy right hand, then settled into the familiar three-punch combination that had carried him through so many fights before this one. Ella had waited 14 long rounds for exactly this sequence. She watched his lead shoulder dip at precisely the moment Logan had described to her countless times in training, watched his rear foot land just slightly behind its usual rhythm, and recognized the narrow opening that had finally arrived. She did not counter immediately. Instead, she allowed Mason to believe he still controlled the exchange completely. She retreated toward the ropes, letting him press forward with growing confidence. From his seat at ringside, Carter Hayes screamed for Mason to finish things once and for all, and that single shout pushed Mason to commit fully to one final, decisive combination. Ella ducked beneath the first punch, slid outside the path of the second, and as the third punch overextended past her shoulder, she rotated her hips and released a short, precise hook directly into Mason's chin. It was not the flashiest punch of the night, nor the hardest in terms of raw power, but it carried the full weight of years spent enduring pain, discipline, and patient waiting. It landed exactly where it needed to land, exactly when it needed to arrive. Mason froze for a fraction of a second. The arena fell into stunned silence. He took one unsteady step backward, then another, his eyes losing their sharp focus entirely. Ella did not charge forward recklessly. She advanced with calm control, landing 2 additional shots to his body, followed by a clean straight punch to his face once his guard had completely collapsed. Mason dropped to the canvas. The referee began counting immediately. Carter Hayes shot up from his seat in disbelief. Ryan Cooper stood frozen, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Madison Blake stared without blinking, her pen forgotten in her hand. Mason attempted to push himself upright, but his body refused to cooperate the way it always had before. He looked across the canvas at Ella, and for the first time all night, his expression carried no trace of mockery, only stunned, undeniable shock. By the count of 10, the referee waved his arms to signal the fight was over. The arena exploded into deafening noise. Ella did not leap into celebration right away. She remained standing at the center of the ring, chest heaving, eyes glistening, her expression remarkably composed given everything her body had just endured. Logan climbed through the ropes and wrapped his arms around her tightly. He did not tell her that she had shocked the world. He told her, quietly, that she had simply taken back something that had always belonged to her in the first place. For a long moment, nobody spoke, nobody cheered, nobody moved. The entire arena seemed suspended somewhere between disbelief and reverence, watching the woman everyone had laughed at less than an hour earlier stand quietly at the center of everything, finally seen for exactly who she had always been. After the fight officially ended, Mason remained seated at his corner for a long while, struggling to process what had just happened. He had not only lost his title, he had lost the carefully constructed image of invincibility that had defined his entire career. The hardest part for Mason was not the defeat itself, but the realization that he had badly misjudged Ella from the very first moment they met. Ella was announced as the new champion to a roar of approval from a crowd that had jeered at her only hours earlier. Broadcasters who had spent the night doubting her now admitted on air that they had completely underestimated her. One of them called it nothing less than one of the greatest reversals in the history of modern boxing, a description nobody in that building seemed inclined to argue against. Within hours, Madison Blake published her investigative feature, revealing how Ella had once been deliberately pushed out of the sport years earlier through manipulated outcomes and quiet institutional pressure. The story spread rapidly across every major outlet. The public began to understand that Ella's victory was not some accidental fairy tale, but the culmination of a long, deliberately buried journey finally brought back into the light. Carter Hayes attempted to avoid reporters gathering outside the arena, but they surrounded him regardless, demanding answers about Ella's past, the disputed decision years earlier, and a series of internal messages that had quickly begun circulating online. The empire he had spent years carefully constructing began showing its first visible cracks that very night. Grace Miller examined Mason shortly afterward and confirmed that he had suffered no serious physical injury, though his composure had clearly been shattered. When he glanced across the ring toward Ella one final time, he no longer wore his familiar smile. He offered only a small, quiet nod, a gesture modest in size yet unmistakable in meaning, an acknowledgement that he had been entirely wrong about her from the very beginning. When Ella finally approached the microphone, many expected her to deliver a sharp, satisfying rebuke aimed directly at Mason. Instead, she said simply that she had not fought to humiliate anyone. She had fought so that nobody else would ever be erased from their own story merely because they lacked power or influence. The arena, still buzzing with energy, grew quiet again to listen closely to every word. In the days following the fight, Madison's investigative feature created a genuine institutional reckoning. The documents she had gathered showed that Carter Hayes had repeatedly intervened in the careers of lesser-known fighters in order to protect his more profitable, marketable stars. Ella had simply been one name among many affected by that pattern, but her story became a symbol because she had returned years later and defeated the system on its own biggest stage. The Boxing Federation opened a formal inquiry shortly afterward. Several retired officials came forward to confirm long-suspected irregularities. Ryan Cooper made the difficult decision to share information confirming that Mason's team had deliberately selected manageable opponents for years to protect his unbeaten record. Ryan did not do this out of resentment toward Mason personally, but because he had grown tired of watching a system that quietly manipulated both fighters and the audiences who trusted what they were shown. Mason faced the media for the first time since his defeat, and rather than blaming injury, officiating, or misfortune, he openly admitted that he had underestimated Ella and allowed his own reputation to cloud his judgment. It was not a complete redemption, but it represented a meaningful first step toward genuine accountability, something the sport rarely witnessed from fighters at his level of fame. Ella returned home to her familiar gym in Baltimore, where the atmosphere felt entirely different from before. Longtime fighters who had trained alongside her for years gathered to greet her, not with hollow admiration, but with quiet respect for someone who had proven that where a person starts does not have to determine where their story eventually ends. Logan looked at the championship belt resting on an old wooden table inside the gym and thought back to the night Ella had been unfairly denied her rightful victory years earlier. a night he had been powerless to prevent. He understood now that justice sometimes arrives painfully late, but it can still arrive, provided someone remains determined enough to keep standing until the very last bell finally sounds. Before long, Ella made the decision to use her newfound platform to launch a support initiative for overlooked fighters, particularly older athletes without sponsors or major backing, who nonetheless possessed genuine, undeniable talent that the sport had simply never bothered to notice. The story closed several months later, with Ella Carter never quite transforming into the kind of loud, flashy celebrity the sport often produced. She remained much the same as she had always been, still training in her old gym despite countless invitations to relocate to far more luxurious facilities. The one undeniable difference was that the entire world now had to address her by a title she had earned through years of patience rather than convenience. Mason Reed began rebuilding from the ground up. He was no longer the unbeaten champion he had once been, but losing to Ella forced him to confront parts of himself he had never previously bothered to examine. In one later interview, he admitted that the final punch in round 15 had done more than knock him down. It had finally shaken him loose from the illusion that fame and greatness were ever truly the same thing. Madison continued investigating the darker corners of professional boxing, eventually becoming a respected voice for fighters who had long been overlooked or forgotten by the sport's larger institutions. Carter Hayes lost control over several major contracts and faced lasting professional consequences for his past conduct. The sport did not transform overnight, but a significant crack had finally formed in a system that had operated unquestioned for far too long. The final scene unfolded quietly inside Ella's modest gym, where she stood in front of the same worn heavy bag she had trained on for years, her new championship belt resting beside a pair of old, faded gloves. Logan asked her gently whether she had ever truly believed she would win the way she ultimately did. Ella answered honestly that she had never known exactly when victory would arrive, only that she could not allow herself to fall before the truth finally had its chance to be heard by everyone watching. Many people would remember that night for the dramatic finish in round 15, the punch that ended an unbeaten reign in a single decisive instant. Ella remembered it differently. To her, that night would always be remembered as the moment the world's laughter finally gave way to something far quieter, far steadier, and far more deserved, a profound and lasting respect.